Today I had a chance to talk with Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie about his book, We the Fallen People. I got this book about a year ago and read about half of it, and it was great. It was captivating. As I say on the podcast, man, I was turning over every page and scribbling on every page. But there is just a fire hose of books coming at us, and I set it aside. It got buried. And I didn't get back to it until a month or so ago when I started to read other people writing about it. And I got an email actually from McKenzie, because he was saying, look, I'm just trying to get this book out there. You don't have to buy it. I will send you a copy for free. And that seemed a little bit, he actually said he'd send 25 copies for free. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go back to that book. And I picked it up and excited that he was willing to give me an hour to talk about this. So this is a book that is looking at the United States at its founding and looking at some of the assumptions of our founders as it relates to human nature and democracy. And it is, he started this 4 years ago, but it seems like he was able to look in a crystal ball and say, what are people going to need to be thinking about and reading at this particular political moment? So he is a thoughtful guy. This is an interesting book. It's not an academic book, but it's not a beach read either, somewhere in between there. But I would commend it to you. We, the Fallen People. And hopefully after you hear our interview, you'll go out and get a copy. Welcome back to another podcast. And we are moving away from the 100+ series that we've been in. And it is my privilege today to have a chance to talk to the author of We the Fallen People. Dr. Robert Tracy McKenzie is a professor at Wheaton College. He is also the Arthur F. Holmes Chair of Faith and Learning there. I did a PhD at Vanderbilt and is the author of several books, has an expertise in the Civil War. And I have already offline brought him greetings from a mutual friend, Nick Perrin. So let me start. So this is the book. I'll hold it up for everybody to see. My copy is heavily marked. I have, oh my goodness, every page sort of gets scribbled on and dog-eared. And so I want to commend you. I've been recommending your book for a while now. I think it's well written and accessible and interesting. And I really, having said all that, I really didn't like it. That's to say, I found it a little unsettling. I don't like your conclusions. I don't disagree with your conclusions. I thought you built your case very, very well, very carefully. It just forced me to think about things that I think are discouraging. And so as we get started, why don't I just ask you, give us a 2-minute flyover of this book.
Well, first of all, Mike, it's a privilege to get to talk with you. I'm grateful for that. And I'm not really surprised when you say there are things about the book that you didn't like. That's been a response I've had pretty regularly when I speak with groups that have read part or all of it. My wife has said that I have the spiritual gift of discouragement, so I credit that. So here's sort of the flyover. The book is about the relationship between the way that we think about democracy and the often unconscious or implicit views that we're holding of human nature at the same time. And I basically think that any attitude that we have toward democracy rests to some degree on understanding of human nature, even if we're not aware of it. Then with that sort of as a background, the book takes a historical overview, starting with the creation of the Constitution in 1787, on through roughly the first half century of American history under the Constitution. And I argue that the common cultural understanding of human nature goes through a radical transformation during that period of a couple of generations or so. At the time of the creation of the Constitution, it was pretty much a truism, largely unchallenged conviction that men and women are fallen, that we are predisposed to be selfish, even though that we are capable of great acts of love or kindness or courage or charity. But we're predisposed to selfishness, and the Constitution took that into consideration. And then within a couple of generations, for all practical purposes, lots of exceptions, but for all practical purposes, the general cultural understanding is that we're basically good. And so I talk about the democratic gospel, which is the idea that we are basically good, and democratic faith, which is the message that we can reliably trust the decisions of the majority to promote just outcomes. So that's the most important theme. I call that the great reversal. And then a lot of the rest of the book is trying to help readers think critically about that. And part of how I go about that is I enlist the help of someone much wiser than I, this visitor to the United States in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville. So I draw a lot from his book, Democracy in America, and try to make that accessible for 21st century readers who are wanting to think Christianly about American democracy.
So I loved about, somewhere partway through the preface, I figured out that it was a setup, and I thought that was very well done. So I have a newsletter goes out on Fridays, and I listed I often have quotes that I think are worth requoting, and I listed this quote attributed to Tocqueville, and then underneath it I said fake news. This was quoted by Eisenhower and Nixon and Clinton and da, but he didn't say it. And not only did he not say it, he wouldn't have said it with a gun to his head. It was very much not what he was thinking. So yeah, so have you read all 900 pages of Tocqueville? I mean, that's impressive.
I have. In fact, I'll have to say I've read it probably, I guess, 4 times through. It's one columnist quite a long time ago said it's one of the great oft-cited, never read books. Yes. And the reality is, I don't think it's read very often today. We're recording this on Friday. I just heard that Salman Rushdie was stabbed. His book, and so one of the younger staff was saying, "Who's he?" And I'm like, "Oh wow." Yeah. But I was explaining. I said he wrote this book, Satanic Verses. I said, one of the books lots of people bought and nobody read. I tried like 3 times, and it was, yes, there's a lot of books out there that people quote that they haven't actually read. So yeah, well, good for you for reading it. I'm glad you did, so some of us don't have to. And I want everybody to know that I read Moby Dick, and I read Brothers Karamazov several times, but yes, not Tocqueville. So here was when I'm talking with people about this book, and again, I have been recommending it. I said, and they asked why. I said, well, there's 4 things. I said, one, so McKenzie says, look, democracy, the founders were very sober-minded about democracy. They do not have the faith in democracy that we have. And I said they were, they just came at this differently. They thought it was the best, it was a good form of government. They were advocating for it. Now, of course, what do they mean by democracy and what do we mean by republic? And these words get used so many different ways by different people, but they were generally saying, yes, we're in favor of this experiment. We're risking our lives to try and make this work. But secondly, they had a very sober view of human nature. Interestingly, it was just sort of fascinating. I said, McKenzie goes and makes the point that the founders were not writing theologically about the Bible or the nature of God or salvation or Jesus. They were writing sort of waxing theological about mankind and human nature and sin. And it was a relatively orthodox view of the fall. People have value, high worth, but are deeply broken and consequently complicated. And then I said, he really doesn't like Andrew Jackson. So I don't know if you know, I listen to a podcast, Jonah Goldberg. He used to be with the National Review. He's got this thing called The Remnant. And every time Woodrow Wilson's name gets mentioned, he always has this Darth Vader Star Wars music come on. He really doesn't like Woodrow Wilson. And I thought, McKenzie needs to have this Darth Vader music come on every time Andrew Jackson.
I didn't know much about Jackson. Populist was about all I knew, but wow, you don't like Jackson. And then and I said, then the fourth thing is, I said, he sort of projects ahead and tries to figure out where we ought to go. And I said, I said, those are my four takeaways. So let me ask you to comment a little bit more on each of these four. So the founders favored democracy to a degree, but they were very skittish in this endorsement, and they meant something a little bit different by democracy. They didn't imagine this popular election of a president. So what were they advocating for, and how far did they advocate?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's complicated. The answer is complicated because words change their meaning over time. And the framers of the Constitution wouldn't have even used the word democracy. It meant something very specific in that context, not what we mean today. But what they did believe was that the majority should rule. And in fact, they would have said, and they did say over and over again, that that's the litmus test of a truly free people. If the majority is not ultimately prevailing, they would have said you don't live in a form of government that's accountable to the public will. And of course, the Declaration of Independence said that's the foundation of legitimate government, is the consent of the governed. So they held two things in tandem simultaneously. They said the majority must prevail, and they said the majority is predisposed to seek their own interests over the common good. And that's holding two things in tension that aren't comfortably held together, and we don't like that. What the Jacksonian America would have done half a century later is they say that tension doesn't exist. We don't have to worry about majority rule because people naturally are virtuous. They naturally seek the good of others. And so that tension goes away. But the thing I try to stress to readers is we can't understand our Constitution as it was structured without understanding that tension that the framers felt. All those attributes of the Constitution, the separation of powers, the checks and balances that we allude to, those were all growing out of an understanding of human nature, which said that while we want to see the majority prevail ultimately, we sort of want to slow down the process of government if possible, because we don't actually think the whims or the passions of the population are very reliably just. And so you slow down that process of government. So when we complain today about government not being able to act quickly, there's a sense in which that's a really legitimate complaint. It's also a sense in which the framers intended for government to not be able to act quickly.
To be reflective. So, okay, well, I certainly, I remember waking up to the idea that everybody defers to the market and let the market decide. It's a million people voting, and all of a sudden going, but wait a minute, but it's a million selfish people voting. It's just we're just multiplying in one sense now to be clear, I always want to say this, I'm a capitalist. I can't come up with a better system. Capitalism that is shaped by Christian compassion and conviction seems to me to be the best that we're going to get, but it's broken. It's a broken system. It will have flaws. So when it comes to our government, yes, I don't know. I'm a little nervous, a little gun shy since you took away the Tocqueville quote. Did Churchill say democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms of government?
As far as I know.
Okay.
But I'm not going to stake my reputation on that. But as far as I know.
So I feel that way about our government. It's the best system that we can get. I've traveled a lot. I always say to people, wow, you feel a lot better about the United States when you spend time in Africa, Asia, Latin America. I mean, wherever you want to go. So I was unprepared, I guess, for how skeptical they were that democracy would work long term. Did they? So their views, as you're saying, they had a very alert view of human nature. They were aware that we were broken. is this just because they were paying attention? And is this, I mean, does this really sort of take on a more thoughtfulness after the, you know, the initial effort at democracy, and then it's not working and they've got to call the convention together and give the, you know, the federal government more power than they had given it? Is it shaped by scripture at all? I mean, is there evidence to say somebody's reading Paul and Romans and saying we're really more broken?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, to some degree, I shy away from that because it's a question that Christians have often wanted to argue about in the public square. The short answer is most of the prominent individuals that shaped the Constitution didn't talk about their personal beliefs, personal religious beliefs openly, and nor did they make explicitly scriptural arguments. So if you read through the notes of the Constitutional Convention, or if you read through the notes of the 13 ratification conventions that took place, you're just not going to find more than a handful of allusions explicitly to scripture. Having said that, I think we acknowledge that culturally, there's this context in which the acceptance of what a theologian would call original sin was still widespread. And I think the framers of the Constitution would have said that in addition to the sort of traditional teachings of Christianity, they would have said history taught that men and women were basically selfish. They thought philosophy taught that. Classical literature taught that. So there are all kinds of influences that are dovetailing to sort of reinforce this understanding of human nature that they held.
What's interesting, yes, I mean, if you look at history, you've got, you know, Plato doesn't advocate democracy, and everybody's always skeptical of everybody else, and with Socrates, others, maybe you've got that self-skepticism a little bit more prominent. And I think it was Chesterton who said that depravity is the only doctrine we can get just by reading the paper or looking at our heart, whatever. Okay, so I've joked that you don't like Jackson. I don't like Jackson after reading your 2 chapters on Jackson, but do you think it's, I mean, did Jackson change things, or Jackson's just the guy who happened to change things? I mean, would we be, it's hard for me to imagine that we would have, you take Jackson out of it, somebody else was going to come along and figure out, hey, there's political magic in saying to the people, I really believe in you, and we're going to do this, and let's take the hill, and together we'll be right and just and good. And
no, that's a great question. And the way historians often deal with that question is they ask whether Jackson sort of literally changes the course of history, or if he really effectively symbolizes larger trends that were unfolding anyway. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I think that's what I would agree with. I'm not really arguing that he changes cultural values as much as he so powerfully, effectively embodies them. You know, his own personal story, which historians have often called attention to, born into poverty. His father dies actually before he's born. He has minimal education. So he's the sort of perfect rags to riches kind of story.
Right.
Before that was a very common sort of stereotype. In fact, he's one of the individuals who helps to create that stereotype. And yet there's all these contradictions. I mean, by the time that he is a candidate for office, he's one of the wealthiest men in America. He has one of the largest plantations in the South. He owns more than 100 slaves himself. I talk in the book about the fine china and the imported tapestries and the piano that cost more than most farms at the time. So, I mean, he hardly was hobnobbing with the common man, but he nicely encapsulated that. And I think we'd have to say, I'm not the only person who says this at all, that he really is the first presidential candidate who benefits from a calculated campaign to craft an image. And so he has supporters who are writing campaign literature, really pushing this idea of the people's candidate, the common man, and so forth. and he benefits from that.
So I'm not going to find out looking at the book, but I've shared with people that you're fairly pessimistic. Again, it feels pessimistic to me. When I was reading the section that talked about the campaign when Jackson is running against Adams, and Jackson, one of them says the other one's mom was a prostitute, and they just have these horrific, scurrilous claims that they're making about the other. I thought, well, this makes me feel a little bit better about today. I mean, this is pretty ridiculous kinds of claims. What is it? Adams likes to wear silk underwear. It's like, okay, let's just sit around and come up with the worst, whatever the worst, come up with things that we can say to try and make the other look bad. But so if that was going on, if there was this kind of animus in the system, are things worse now? I mean, you talk about that this is, going back to the Civil War, the polarization that we have in our country right now is reaching levels not known. So, I mean, you're concerned.
Yeah. So that's a great question. First thing I would say is I like to tell my students that any idea that there was this golden age of civil discourse when everyone was interacting at this really elevated level, that's pretty much a fiction. One of the reasons I was drawn to this period is because there are themes that we would recognize today. Not only is there the intense polarization, but there is, at the time, at least for some, a common response to say that when the other side wins, that's an illegitimate outcome. And that was the whole thrust of the controversy over the election of 1824, when Jackson ultimately doesn't win the runoff in the House of Representatives. Immediately, his supporters say this was stolen. This is fundamentally illegitimate. And Jackson's quite quick to pick up on that and to say that I was the choice of the majority. I wasn't elected, even though, as I point out, he wasn't the choice of a majority of voters,
right,
at all. And so that resonates. I think Americans have always been pretty bitter opponents in the political realm, but there's a line that we cross when we say that this outcome is so fundamentally illegitimate that we can no longer really trust the process anymore. Had Jackson lost again in 1828 when he runs a second time, I think there were individuals who had been quite willing to say, this is a sign that our system is broken and can't work. And so that, to me, is the scary sign. As a historian of the Civil War, I mean, one of the things that I wrestle with is when do we cross a line when individuals say, I simply am not going to accept the outcome of this election. A lot of individuals say, democracy begins not when the majority gets its way. Democracy begins when the minority doesn't get its way and is willing to accept that temporarily. And that I think is the red flag, the warning signal that we need to pay attention to.
I am I'm trying to finish a book for the fall, and I was working on it this week, and I ran across a sermon. It's on the Bible and the authority of Scripture, and I ran across a sermon I had preached back in the mid 2000s, and I referenced the Gore Bush campaign and election, and then I just say, look, it was fascinating, and then it was horrifying, and then we all watched The Hanging Chads, but we sort of knew, and this is me, 15, 20 years ago, we knew that if the Supreme Court ruled, that once they ruled, that would be it. Everybody would trust the outcome. And I remember being a little bit impressed. I remember being thankful that Gore accepted the outcome and just being a little surprised and saying, well, that's not what happens in history a lot of times. But now I read it and I go, oh my goodness, if that happened, there would not be acceptance. What would happen? So I am, I am concerned about just how fragile things seem to be at this particular moment, and I guess that's why perhaps your book is getting such a strong response, or people are saying they don't like it. It's forcing us to sort of chase this down.
Yeah. Can I say something? Can I say one more thing, Matt,
absolutely.
before you go on? You've mentioned a couple of times that there are things about the book that are discouraging. I just would want to stress that I think the takeaway message from the framers of the Constitution is there was a measure of optimism in their approach. For one thing, if they had no hope for human nature, they wouldn't have said we have to let the majority rule. Their optimism is that they believe that they can structure government in such a way that it can actually, in an incremental way, promote more just outcomes. And I think that actually grew out of their skeptical understanding of human nature. They said, because men and women are selfish, if we take that into consideration and structure government in a certain way, we actually can arrive at acceptable outcomes, morally acceptable outcomes more often than not. But the secret began with their understanding, not that we're basically good, but that we tend to be self-interested.
But wouldn't they have said that people have to be virtuous, or they're, we've got these quotes, that we need religious people. I think of you had an Os Guinness reference somewhere in there, that his triangle of virtue and freedom and faith. And we've got to have faith in order to have freedom, and we've got to have freedom in order to have, I'd have to think about how that triangle works. I just know that one of them leads to the next. And there is this sense that there has to be virtuous people, or we just can't hire enough police to try and keep things going. And
yes, and we're back to the idea again that their understanding was complicated. Do they want a citizenry that is virtuous in the sense of denying their self-interest to promote the general welfare? Absolutely. And they're saying that over and over and over again. But as I stress in the book, if you read those quotes in context, and here's the danger, we very often, because particularly Christians, and of course I identify with this desire, but because we're wanting to convince the culture of the importance of religious faith, our temptation is to cherry pick quotes and say, aha, look at this. Very often when the prominent founders are talking about the importance of virtue, they're saying at the same time, we don't see much virtue anywhere. I mean, they're emphasizing virtue because they think there's a lack of it. And their understanding after the Articles of Confederation, which was the first constitution for the United States that lasts for only about 7 or 8 years, their understanding is that we've had too high a view of human nature. We thought people would naturally seek the good of others, and we're just not sure that was accurate at all. So the framers are doing two things simultaneously. They're exhorting the public to exercise virtue, and they believe that religion is the best foundation for virtue. Absolutely. But at the same time, they're saying, and this is not our natural bent to be good. And the reality is, in the context of the late 18th century, when they're promoting the importance of religion and saying that individuals are basically selfish, most of the pastors across the land would say, amen. That's exactly what we're preaching from the pulpit. It's only a later time when that's seen as more sort of intention.
Right. So, well, let me steer this in a couple of different directions. First of all, I've read a couple of your other books. I read your book on history, a little
book for new historians.
Yeah, is that is that title sort of a knockoff of Telica, a little exercise for young theologians, or is there just a whole?
It's a series InterVarsity Press does. They have Little Book for New, all different disciplines. So I just was given that title.
Okay, well, so I read that, and I also read your book on Thanksgiving. And I know I heard this somewhere that you really don't like to be asked the question, what did they have to eat on the first Thanksgiving? So I've got another question that I know you really don't want to be asked. I'm not going to ask it. And that is, is America founded as a Christian country? Mm-hmm. I get asked that, and I'm frustrated enough because people want a yes or no answer. And it's like, wow, that's just such a complicated question. Yeah. But I hear you writing about, I mean, you say in the preface or somewhere that you like America, you love America, you're patriotic. So in what ways is America exceptional?
Oh boy, you know, that's a hard question. And gosh, I don't know that I want to touch it. But can I just, if I were to give you a simplistic answer,
okay,
it would be that what I think you could argue what made the constitutional system so extraordinarily successful was its realistic understanding of human nature. I mean, that's one of the things that separates, say, the French Revolution from the you know, and so when I write, in part, sort of with a kind of prophetic voice to contemporary Americans, because I want to see this country flourish, I think that, as I say in the book, I believe we ground our support for democracy on the wrong foundation. I don't want Americans to reject democracy. I want them to build their commitment to democracy on a foundation that will last. And I just don't think it's a belief in the sort of innate goodness of human beings.
Right. So Tocqueville sees some of this, and you certainly celebrate him. He comes up, let's just say he comes off better than Jackson does.
He does. Yeah. Definitely, yes.
Young guy at the time that he does this, why, and I know you talk about this, but talk about this in the book. Talk about why you think this young Frenchman is able to see things so clearly and to offer this assessment of the American experiment and our wrestling with freedom.
Yeah. So for your listeners, Tocqueville is this young Frenchman. He's 25 when he comes to the United States, which is hard for me to imagine. Spends about 9 months in country, spends another 8 or 9 years reflecting on what he thought, and then he writes this 900-page book. Scholars would say that Tocqueville is what we call a liminal figure, meaning he sort of doesn't fit into any neat category. He's born after the French Revolution, so he's from aristocratic lineage, but the old sort of aristocratic world is passing away. But he's certainly not yet a product of our world, so he just doesn't fit. And so I think he really comes to America as an outsider. He's neither American nor is he democratic in his natural sort of values. He's very sympathetic, though, with the United States, but he also is willing to be critical. And as he puts it in one point, he says that, you know, our friends rarely tell us the truth, and our enemies we don't listen to. And he wants to be that friend who tells us the truth. And so he comes to the United States and he's asking himself two questions. Let me back up and say he absolutely believes democracy is the wave of the future. What he wants to ask is, what will this mean for his two deepest commitments? And he tells you that his two deepest commitments are liberty and human dignity. So having lived after the French Revolution, his parents have been imprisoned and so on, he worries what will happen to liberty, what will happen to human dignity in a democratic society. What do I have to fear? What do I have to hope? And he actually makes a compelling case that democracy is not intrinsically just or unjust. It is morally indeterminate.
Right.
Very last sentence of the book is that democracy can end in liberty or tyranny, civilization or anarchy, poverty or misery. And so he's holding up this wide range of possible outcomes that democracy can lead to. And I think it ought to scare the dickens out of us. And then he begins to talk about what is it about America that has allowed it to flourish so far.
Because the people are not virtuous. I'm here, and they're not virtuous.
Yeah, he says what he says is that Americans sure think they're virtuous, but he says explicitly, I don't see it. But he talks about things. He talks about the circumstances. He believes that just the the geography of the United States, these vast oceans that at the time protected the United States from external threat, allowed the government to be smaller than it would have been if war was a constant possibility. He's a deep admirer of the founding generation. He believes that Jacksonian America has inherited a set of political institutions that they're benefiting from. And the irony is they no longer accept the worldview that undergirded those institutions, but they're still reaping the benefits of them. So he talks about that. Then he talks about mores. And that's a term we don't use much anymore, but sometimes it's referred to as habits of the heart, these attitudes that we bring to our lives with one another. And when he looks at the mores of American people, he says that it's not that Americans are naturally virtuous, but they've learned what he calls habits of restraint. And he argues that, in effect, that they've learned that their first impulses often aren't in their own interest. And so they delay gratification. They try to tolerate individuals who differ from them in their beliefs and so forth, believing that they reap the benefits of that in the long term. And so the question then, that we would ask today is, do we have those same sorts of values? Do Americans, do they have habits of restraint, for example? Do we have a kind of skepticism of our own inclinations that leads us to be a little bit more patient and charitable to others? I'm not going to answer that question for you, but I think those are the questions to ask.
Well, as you're describing it this way, this idea that Jackson was sort of living off of the credit of the founders, it sounds a little bit like Nietzsche suggesting that the 20th century, as soon as it ran past the halo effect of the Christian worldview, as soon as God was truly dead, that it was going to go in a very different direction than everybody thought. Everybody thought it would be wonderful and that we're good people. We're going to hold hands. We're going to sing, kumbaya. We're going to share. Everybody's going to get along. And Nietzsche said, no, not at all. And Jackson is sort of saying, we're good. We just have to rely on our goodness. And this is going to be great. And Tocqueville's saying, nah, not really sure how this is going to play out.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Tocqueville coins this. It's a concept that exists beforehand, but he really sort of articulates it well, called the tyranny of the majority. And one of the things that he was aware of was that, and the framers would have accepted this, that power always is a threat to liberty. It doesn't matter who wields it, whether it's a dictator or a majority, that in the United States, the potential for the majority to oppress minority was great, but he doesn't believe that is happening as much as he would have expected. And when he looks at the answers why, he tends to point toward things that, from a Christian perspective, I say were more the grace of God than the virtue of the American people. And I think that's a message that we need to hear. Tocqueville is writing, his background, 4 of the 9 closest members of his family had been guillotined during the French Revolution. He believes that mass rule can lead to all kinds of horrific outcomes. The trick is to let the people rule and avoid that. But he never thinks that is natural. It's not inevitable. Coming back to the last sentence, democracy can lead to tyranny just as much as to liberty.
So, used to be that I was surprised at the way people talked about the founders and talked about the Constitution. And there was just a reverence or a default, or it's in the Constitution and the founders. And there was almost not a deification, but just this mystical aura that surrounded them. I didn't think much of it. Recently, I hear people, and I mean, I don't want to just pick on the left, because I think we see some crazy stuff going on the right also, but I hear people on the left making very illiberal statements that they don't like democracy, they're not in favor of it, or freedom of speech is not a good idea. There are some thoughts that should not ever be expressed. And it used to be that I expected those people, I just thought that they were just being hypocrites. And as soon as you, and that even if you pointed out to them, you're being a hypocrite, you believe in free speech, but you're trying to shut down these people, and that's just being hypocritical. But now I don't hear that. I hear, no, I don't believe in free speech. You don't have the right to say what you want to say. And I'm sort of shocked on the other side. I'm like, oh my goodness. I'm a little bit more scared of where we're at today than in the past. It's just like, okay, the founders, I don't think they hung the moon, but it seems like it's the best we got going. So you want to treat them like they walked on water. I'm not perfectly okay with that, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to talk you out of it. Now I feel a little bit more unnerved by what I see. You think I should be?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to be unnerved by. I would argue, I think I would argue this pretty strongly, that because I think we're fallen, I think Americans' commitment to some of the values that the framers bequeathed to us has always been pretty inconsistently applied. And one of the things that I argue in the book, even from the very beginning, when Andrew Jackson is really beginning to abuse the power of his office, it's his supporters who say that's fine, and his opponents who say, wait a minute, there's a principle here involved, right? But it tends to be that our skepticism of power really kicks into high gear when we're not the ones wielding power. And then when we have the power, it's amazing how that tends to fall away. And so I think you see that today. I think when someone, you gave the example, when someone on the left says, I don't believe in free speech, what they're essentially imagining, I think, is a position where they will have enough cultural power to regulate what gets accepted and what doesn't. And of course, if we take the fall seriously, I think our political philosophies start with the idea that power will be abused, and what is a way to distribute power that minimizes that. Yeah. And one of the ways philosophers approach that is to say, always imagine that when you're thinking of your values, political values, imagine that you don't know who will be in the majority, that you don't know who's going to have the power. Is it a system that you could live with if you were in the minority and vulnerable? And to me, the example that you gave is just an example of people who are not thinking very far down the road. And that's one of the things that Toffel said in the 1830s. He says, he says, he's writing really to his French neighbors, but he says, I'm not sure that I have confidence that this generation really is committed to liberty. And I think we have, every generation, we sort of have to evaluate again, are we truly committed to liberty, or are we willing to make really short-sighted compromises in the short term that have devastating consequences in the long term?
I'm not sure. I mean, I realize I'm sort of late to the party, but 10 years ago, I started to realize everybody's writing about freedom, whether they call it freedom or not, but it's like the word liberal. It can mean, classic liberalism means something radically different. And I'm listening to people, and some people are talking about negative freedom, some people are talking about positive freedom, and it's just like, wow, there's a lot of not communicating going on here around this topic of freedom. And I am, your book helped me, unfortunately, understand just how fragile some of these things are.
Yeah.
So let me ask this. Let's just play out. I mean, it's hard to look ahead and imagine that at any point in the next couple of years, things get better. I keep looking for Abraham Lincoln. I'm tempted to write him in for office because I think we really need, and I've been down to the Lincoln Library in Springfield recently, and that was just helpful to just realize how difficult his job was and how he was just being so mercilessly attacked. And I was a little traumatized to hear what the names people were calling him. I wanted to say, wait, don't you understand? He's the best president we had. So looking ahead at, hard to imagine that whoever wins in 2024, we don't even know who's going to run. I mean, it sure looks like Trump's going to run and Biden says he's going to run. Who knows who's going to get the nominations? That's a long time away, but hard to imagine anybody losing and accepting defeat.
Yeah.
So how does this play out? You're a historian. I mean, America is unique in this sense. Our government is unique, but how do cultures correct? I mean, I think if you asked me that question, I'd say, well, revival,
yeah,
war, total destruction, and you start over. Is there a more moderate correction that gets us back to something that looks like it's sustainable? I mean, that sounds very pessimistic to ask, but it feels like it's part of the question we should be asking.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've been reading a lot, just even this summer, from social psychologists and political scientists, and everybody has a position on this. And some of the things that I think are going on are sort of difficult to explain briefly, and probably beyond our ability to control. I mean, when you're thinking about an individual citizen, what can I do that could possibly have a positive benefit? That can be super, super daunting. Here's what I like to do, Mike, if you'll let me, and that's to sort of reframe the question just a little bit. I don't know what the solution is that turns down the heat and reduces some of the bitter polarization that our public life exhibits right now. I really wrote the book out of a concern for the testimony of the church, in this context. And I say early on, I just long to see Christians thinking Christianly about the way that they engage. And I'm not convinced that we always do. So even though we can't make this polarization go away, I think individually, in our small circles of relationship, in the way that we interact with others online and in the flesh, we can begin to be consciously aware of what's going on in theological terms. And the way I understand this polarization that we have is I see a culture in which we're divided. The stories that sort of enfold us are always us versus them stories. It's not a common effort toward a common good. It's us versus them. And we fall trap to stories where those folks, whoever they are, we're not really attributing the image of God to them. I always like to come back to C.S. Lewis's quote, "You've never met a merely ordinary human being."
Right.
But we don't think that way about those folks. And then when we're thinking about our group, however we define that, we're not really feeling very heavily the weight of original sin. I love Alexander Solzhenitsyn's famous quote where he said, one of the ways to understand all this is to ask, where does the line that separates good and evil run?
Right.
And
through my heart.
says, right through every individual heart. But when you listen to political rhetoric, we're always externalizing evil. If those people could be thwarted, our lives would be better. And so at the very least, as Christians, we need to have some radar that goes off and says, now, wait a minute, that's not true. That is a contradiction of the gospel. And it may not necessarily immediately lead to change in our political system, but as Christians, we don't have to be fueling the polarization that is so destabilizing our political system.
It does seem like, I mean, I read this, I read the statistics that say, only 3% of people tweet, and they're on the extreme left and the extreme right, and you'd feel a lot better about the world if you just spent more time with your neighbors, whatever their political convictions might be. So I hear that. I don't, at least at this stage, I don't see anybody who is being ironic going very far. Yeah. These are hard. As you know, I mean, as an academic, people want greater certitude. They want simple. I think you've got a quote about that. Simple and wrong is going to go a lot further than.
That's Tocqueville, actually. Yeah.
And I was listening today, I was thinking of Neil Postman's statement that, part of the real challenge about TV is not what's on it, and it's just the way it's changed our ability to be engaged in a conversation. And like the Lincoln Douglas debates, whether this is true or not, I think he said they were like 6 hours long. And now it's, Senator so-and-so, what's your view on the Middle East? You've got 30 seconds to answer. Mm-hmm. Well, your only thing you can say is, I'm for Israel, right? I mean, I got that. I can't have a nuanced answer. And people don't like nuance. And, but, okay, well, by the way, a couple of years ago, I was at a conference, and it was a political scientist was speaking. He made a statement that he said he had studied, his doctoral work had been on civilizations that had collapsed. He had studied 30 some civilizations that had collapsed. And he said they all had two things in common. One was debt, and two was sexual immorality. And then he went on and he was talking about other things. And at the end, I raised my hand and I said, okay, debt and sexual immorality. I think I've seen that. How long do we have? And he said, look, when it goes quickly, something like that. And I called him a couple of years later. I said, did you say, because he said, every time I see these two things, the society collapses. And I said, did you really say that? And he said, I said it, but I don't want to be cited. He goes, he teaches at some university. He says, I can't say every time, but say mostly. I can live with mostly. So I just find myself saying, okay, well, I need to be gracious and loving and humble. Your call, humility, self-awareness. I'm always going to mishandle power whenever I get it. I'm going to have to just assume that, and to pray for revival. I'm a pastor, so I always say, look, the other institutions, the family, the state, government, media, business, no one's got a chance unless we do our job, right? We've got to see people changed by Jesus, and that's my lane, so I'm going to stay in it. Well, so thank you. Thank you. What are you working on now? You have I think I read this was a 4 or 5 year project. So
that's right. Well, it's a good question, and ironic because of what you commented on, Mike. I'm actually right at the beginning of a book that tentatively I'm calling Before the House Divides Again, listening to Lincoln before the next Civil War, because I actually think he had a lot of things that we need to hear that are relevant today. Okay, well, I will look forward to hearing that, reading that, and having you back on when that book rolls out. I hope we don't need it for like another 10 years, so take your time, but I have a feeling you might want to get this one out there sooner than that. Yeah. And this will only be like the 10,000th book on Abraham Lincoln, right? I mean, yeah. So we certainly need another one, right? That's my thinking. I wrote a book on Jesus, so I've actually contributed in a realm where there's 100,000 books. So anyway, well, thank you so much for being generous with your time, and thank you for this book. Much to think about. I will pass along your greetings to Dr. Perrin, and we'll look forward to an excuse to talk to you again. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Mike. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.